guys? My name is Matthew Francis, and I'm the TA for Bio 476, Section 7, from 440 to 635. I want to bring you guys an additional supplementary resource. Supplementary being additional means this resource is not meant to replace your time in lecture, lab, or office hours. I repeat, this resource is not meant to replace your time in lecture, lab, or office hours. I took this class about a year ago, and um, I always wanted an additional resource that could help me understand these anatomical terms and relationships a little bit better. And I was introduced to Anatomy TV. This is a resource that you guys all have and pay for through PSU libraries, so you guys can all access this whenever you want. I used this resource very heavily when I was in this class because it helped me understand these visual spatial relationships. It helped me see a different perspective than I would have received in class or in lab or in office hours. So I wanted to bring this resource to you guys and help you. And basically, these videos are going to be like 30 minutes. They should not be too long. I know we all have short attention spans. So if you get to sit down for about 30 minutes, and I'm going to run through the content sheet for each week. These videos will be weekly. This one is a little bit late because I didn't get the go ahead to do it um, until not too recently. But I hope these resources and these videos are helpful to you guys. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Hopefully, I didn't miss anything. I'm pretty sure I said everything, but we're gonna get started with the dry bones. But these videos, I'm not gonna go through the transverse coronal and sagittal cross sections because I have Quizlets that already go over that. So you guys can use those links and look at the Quizlets and go through those. But for now, we're going to start with the skeleton dry bones. So the first structure that we're gonna look at is the sternum. So here, press multiple. Um, Wait, before we actually go through the sternum, I want to go through anatomical positioning. That is my bad. So to start off with anatomical positioning, we need to know anatomical positioning before we even start to look at structures because anatomical positioning lets us know and understand terms in reference to the basic anatomical landmarks. Right? So if I'm looking at the sternum, I know the sternum is anterior to the seventh thoracic vertebra, whereas the seventh thoracic vertebra is posterior to the sternum. I know that the manubrium is superior to the sternal body, whereas the sternal body is inferior to the manubrium. Looking at proximal and distal, which refer to the distance away from an attachment point, I know that the head of the humerus, right here, is proximal to this joint, this glenohumeral joint, or this attachment point. Whereas the end of the humerus, which would be about here, is distal away from this attachment point. Right? The humerus is not this large. Sorry, the humerus is not this small. It's a lot bigger in your body. So this is about cut in half. The humerus would be about 2 times as long as this, right? So it would end about somewhere here. Um, but that being said, right? So the end of the humerus is distal away from this attachment point. Right, now we're going to go over medial and lateral. Medial defines the midline of the body. Lateral defines the sides of the body. So the sternum is medial to the humerus, whereas the humerus is lateral to the sternum, right? So medial towards the midline, lateral towards the side. Now we're going to look at superficial and deep. So I think the best representation or the best way I can visually show you this is that looking at this fifth lumbar vertebra, right? So, and we just examine it or inspect it, right? So looking at the surface right here, right? The surface right in front of the vertebra. So if I remove from inspection, if I look at the surface here of this vertebra, that would be superficial. So superficial means on top of the surface, right? So on the surface or on top of, same thing, right? If I inspect it, if I'm going into the middle of the vertebral body, right, that would be deep, right? So superficial on the inside is deep. So now that we have that, I'm going to go over the cross-sectional directions, and then we're going to move into the dry bones. So the first cross-sectional direction is sagittal. So sagittal goes from superior to inferior, and it splits the body into two right and left halves. All right. And then now we're going to do coronal. Coronal just splits the body into anterior and posterior portions. So anterior, posterior, the cut would be here, right? And then we have transverse or horizontal, splits the body into superior and inferior portions. So if I cut like this, right, transverse, you have a superior and an inferior portion, right? And that would be our three planes. Now we're going to move on to our dry bones or our skeleton. So sternum, the first bone we're going to be looking at is the sternum. So we have the manubrium, sternal body, xiphoid process. If I inspect manubrium superiorly and xiphoid process inferiorly. All right, now we're going to move on to the rib. I'm going to be going through these pretty fast because you guys can literally just slow down the video. So I'm going to try not to go too fast, but I'm going to be moving at a decent pace for sure. Now I'm going to inspect this fifth rib here. We have the head of the rib. Then we have the subcostal groove. And then we have the tubercle of the rib right here. All right, now we're going to move on to the vertebra. We have, I'm going to inspect one vertebra. We have the vertebral body. We have the transverse process here. Transverse process. Let me move this a little bit better. We have the transverse process right here. Okay, so transverse process. And then we have the spinous process here. And then we also have the vertebral foramen. So I'm going to bring that back. I'm going to press a few. So we have the spinous process, right? You can see that all here. We have the transverse process. And then we can also see the intervertebral foramen. Right, these are where your spinal roots are coming out of. And you can also see the vertebral foramen. Right, so that's all the structures, right? Intervertebral foramina being multiple foramen between the vertebra. Okay, or multiple openings. Right, so I'm not going to be going through the cross sections, coronal, sagittal, and transverse because I already have Quizlets, as I said. And now we're going to move into the muscles of the thorax. All right, so now continuing with the muscles of the thorax that we're going to be learning for this week, we have the diaphragm, right? If we look inferiorly, we see the diaphragm, this big muscle that controls breathing. All right, so the diaphragm is here. If I remove the diaphragm, then I can see the muscles on the thoracic wall. I'm going to start anteriorly, looking at internal intercostals, right? Towards, these are more medial. And then we have external intercostals, which are more lateral, right? So that's exactly how we're going to pin them, right? So external intercostals, more lateral, internal intercostals, more medial, right? And it says intercostal internus, right? So especially with Anatomy TV, you're gonna see some different anatomical names, but the ones that are on the content sheet are the only ones you need to know. So internal intercostals, external intercostals, and you can always search up some of these terms if you don't know. You have the you have the big web as a resource. Right. So now I'm going to go into transverse thoracis. Right. So you see here, transverse thoracis. Right. You can kind of see the shape. You can kind of see that flower-like shape. Transverse thoracis is on the interior side of the rib cage. Interior rib cage, right? All right. So now we're going to move into the vasculature. But before we do that, I want you guys to see how transverse thoracis looks. Similarly to how when we remove the rib cage on the donors. Right? It looks very similar. You kind of see that flower-like shape or that leaf-like shape. All right, so I know this seems like a lot looking at it from this perspective, right? So there's a lot of arteries and veins you don't need to know here, but I'm going to highlight them in a way for you guys to understand them a little bit better, right? So it's not going to look like this when I highlight them, but we're going to go down the vasculature part of the content list. So the first thing I'm going to highlight is the aorta, right? So you have the abdominal aorta, descending aorta, arch of the aorta, right? And the ascending aorta. So I'm going to examine, right? So that's the aorta right there, right? So it kind of makes it so it's a little bit better to visualize it, right? So that's the aorta. All right, now we're going to move on to the superior vena cava. Examine. Let me press that there. All right, so we have the superior vena cava. All right, examine. Let me remove that aspect of the aorta, the ascending aorta. All right, so superior vena cava. All right, superior vena cava. And I examine it. I'm going to press inferior, superior, inferior vena cava, both draining into the right atrium. Now I'm going to have you guys visualize intercostal artery and intercostal vein. And I might as well just highlight the aorta as well, just so you guys can see all these different structures in relation to each other. Okay, let me just press that last part. Okay. All right, so we see the aorta, we see the inferior and superior vena cava. Now I'm going to highlight intercostal artery and vein. All right, so intercostal artery, intercostal. So that's the. Ooh, you got to be very specific with what you're pressing. All right, so intercostal artery and intercostal vein. Okay. All right, so intercostal artery, intercostal vein. We see inferior, superior vena cava. We see the aorta. All right, so remember that the intercostal vein, artery, and nerve, these are bilateral structures as well. So I'm going to press on the nerve just so you guys can see that running in the subcostal groove as well. So, okay. Okay. All right, so you can kind of see just in this individual section, you can see the intercostal vein, artery, and nerve running with each other, right, in the subcostal groove. All right, so then I also want to highlight the internal thoracic artery and vein, right, which are right next to the sternum. If I'm looking on the interior side of the rib cage, if I press these two structures right here, internal thoracic artery and internal thoracic vein. If I examine, right, I can see them right here. So internal thoracic artery and internal thoracic vein. Right. I hope that's a better picture for you. That's a little bit better, right? So internal thoracic artery, internal thoracic vein. Right? Remember these are bilateral structures. So you're going to see the intercostal vein, artery, and nerve on both sides. You're going to see the internal thoracic artery and internal thoracic vein on both sides as well, right? These are just the right? They're going to have these sets of structures on the left as well, right? Right? But you're not going to have two superior and inferior vena cavas. There's only one, right? So one superior and one inferior vena cava, one aorta. Okay, and then we're going to move on to the last structure, which is the azygos vein. Right, azygos vein is here in the back, resting right on top of the vertebral body of multiple vertebra. And then we're going to have that here, right? So that is the azygos vein. Right, unilateral structure, sound on both sides, azygos vein. Right, so that's going to be all the way in the posterior of the thorax, posterior region of the thorax, right? And remember, this is a branch of the superior vena cava. Right, and then I'm gonna go, since we already dipped somewhat into the nerve section, I'm going to show the phrenic nerve as well. Remember, we have a right and a left phrenic nerve, so let me go and get that selected. Okay, there we go. Okay. Alright, so we have the right and left phrenic nerve selected. It's kind of hard to see, but they are present. Right? You gotta make sure that you're touching it exactly. Okay. So we see our phrenic nerve. I'm gonna try to highlight it a little bit better so you guys can see it. One phrenic nerve is right there, and second one is right there. And I'm also going to have the diaphragm. I'm gonna put an examine. Let me add the diaphragm as well. Okay, diaphragm, right? And examine, right? You can see the left and the right phrenic nerve, and then you can see them touching the diaphragm. Makes sense, right? Because the phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. And now you see aorta, and you also see these arteries here, the intercostal arteries, but I just want to get you guys to understand that the phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm, and it's a bilateral structure. All right. I think we're just gonna call that a day because you guys can see that. All right. But now we're going to move on to the trachea and the lungs. Okay, now that we're here looking at the trachea and the lungs, let me remove these structures just so you can better see the trachea. Okay, so we have the trachea here, and we know our trachea splits into our right and left primary bronchi, but we'll get to that a little bit later. I just want to show you guys the visceral and the parietal pleura. So we have first the parietal pleura, right, on the thoracic wall, parietal pleura. And then we have the visceral pleura directly adhered to the surface of the lungs. Right, so parietal, visceral pleura. Then we have the trachea here. Right, so this structure here is the trachea. Right, so if I examine it, trachea here. Right, we have the trachea, which splits into our right primary bronchi, so right primary bronchus, and our left primary bronchus. And then our right primary bronchus splits into our lobar bronchus, right? So bronchi plural, bronchus singular. And let me unexamine that so we can see the lungs. All right, so we have our right lung with 3 lobes, our left lung with 2 lobes. Our left lung only has 2 lobes because the heart, right, takes up space, right? So our right lung has a upper, middle, and lower lobe, right? So upper, middle, lower lobe. Our left lung only has an upper and a lower lobe. And with these lobes of the lung, we have a transverse or a horizontal fissure. Horizontal. Horizontal and transverse are the same thing, but for the quizzes, please say horizontal fissure. And then we have an oblique fissure. So our right lung has a horizontal and an oblique fissure. So horizontal means in this horizontal plane, left to right, or right to left, and oblique means sideways. Right? So right lung has an oblique and horizontal fissure, whereas our right lung has an oblique and a horizontal fissure, whereas our left lung only has an oblique fissure. Now, if we look at the inferior aspect of our lungs, we see the diaphragmatic surfaces on the right and left lung. So diaphragmatic surface. If I press the diaphragm, it's called the diaphragmatic surface because those aspects of the lung rest directly on the diaphragm. Now I'm going to show you guys the hilum. All right, so if I pull out this portion, right? If I hide this for now, you can kind of see. Let me just get a better, yeah, I'm going to do it like this. I'm just going to remove the lungs for now, just so that we can see the trachea correctly, right? So we have our trachea again. We have our right primary bronchus, left primary bronchus. These two are bronchi plural. And then we have our lobar bronchus, our right lobar bronchus, and then we have our left lobar bronchus. Right? Okay? Make sense? All right, so this is what you're going to be seeing inside of the hilum, right? The bronchus, the lobar bronchus. All right, now I'm going to move on to a better image where we can actually see the hilum, right? So this is the hilum. I'm going to remove the parietal pleura. I'm going to remove the visceral pleura. Right now we're looking at the right lung, right? And these structures here, so right, I'm going to remove the pulmonary trunk. Okay, and now we have our pulmonary artery. Then we have our pulmonary veins. All right, and then we're also going to, let me remove these parts of the trachea here. I don't know if I can get a good image, but you're also gonna have your your right primary bronchus, right, going into your hilum, right, and inside the right primary bronchus would be your right lobar bronchus. And I'm trying to get a better image so you can see that. Let me hide that. Right, so inside, right, so that's where you would have the lobar bronchus. Right, so that's what you're seeing when we pin inside of the primary bronchus, right, inside of the hilum. Right, so we have the hilum, we have the right primary bronchus. When we pin inside of the right primary bronchus, inside of that, that's where you'll have the lobar bronchus, right? Makes sense. All right, so I already showed you the pulmonary arteries, the pulmonary veins. We can go over that one more time. Right, so we have I'm going to remove the pulmonary trunk, right? And then we have our pulmonary artery, right pulmonary artery. Then we have our right pulmonary veins, right? And then we have our right primary bronchi, which splits into our right lobar bronchi. Sorry, right primary bronchus, which splits into our right primary bronchus. Right, so right primary bronchus splits into our right lobar bronchus. I keep pronouncing it wrong, but bronchus singular, bronchi plural. So our right primary bronchus splits into our right lobar bronchus. And the last structure that we need to know is the apex of the lung, right? So the apex of the lung is just the highest point, and that would be right here. Right, and that covers everything for week 1 for the content sheet. Please let me know if this is a helpful resource. Again, this resource is meant to be a supplement and not a replacement for your time spent in lecture, lab, and in class. So I hope this resource helps, and hope you guys do well in your quizzes. See you next week.